A racist woman insulted a black man on a plane, assuming he was beneath her. Little did she know, he was a renowned astronaut, and the news the next day would leave her in utter regret. Stay with us to witness a powerful story of prejudice, realization, and redemption. Subscribe now for more stories that challenge stereotypes and inspire change. We truly enjoy. The boarding process for Flight 297 from New York to Houston was as chaotic as ever. Passengers jostled for space in the overhead bins, while flight attendants directed traffic through the crowded aisles. Among them was Dr. Elias Grant, a black man in his early 40s. Dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, he carried himself with an understated confidence. Moving with the ease of someone used to navigating busy environments, Elias found his seat by the window in row 16, and settled in with a journal article on advanced astrophysics. As a decorated astronaut and physicist, he preferred to travel without drawing attention to his accomplishments. This trip was no different. He had just finished speaking at a conference, and was looking forward to a quiet flight home. Nearby, Margaret Wilson adjusted her designer handbag, and looked over the other passengers with a critical eye. Her face tightened when she saw Elias sitting in the window seat. She hadn't even spoken to him yet, but her judgment was already clear. Margaret stopped abruptly when she reached row 16, where Elias was seated. She sighed loudly and glanced at the overhead bin, making a show of trying to find space for her bag. "Excuse me," she said curtly. Elias immediately stood to let her pass, stepping into the aisle to accommodate her. As Margaret squeezed into her seat, she muttered under her breath, "These flights really need better standards." Elias chose to ignore her comment, and returned to his seat, focusing on his journal. But Margaret wasn't done. Her gaze fell on the technical paper in his hands, and her lips curled into a smirk. "Reading that, are you?" she asked. "Looks a bit advanced." Elias turned his head slightly, offering her a polite but brief smile. "Yes, I find it fascinating." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her smirk widening. "Fascinating, huh? Well, I suppose everyone's entitled to try." Her words were sharp enough to draw the attention of a passenger across the aisle, who glanced at Elias sympathetically before looking away. Margaret noticed the movement and smiled smugly, confident she was entertaining the audience. Elias tightened his grip on the edge of the journal, forcing himself to remain calm. Years of experience had taught him to navigate moments like this with grace, but Margaret's tone carried the sting of a deeper prejudice. Margaret leaned back, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Bet you didn't even go to college. People like you usually just fake their way through." Elias exhaled quietly, his calm exterior betraying none of the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He glanced around the cabin, noticing passengers exchanging uneasy glances. Some turned away, unwilling to intervene, while others discreetly pulled out their phones, sensing a scene unfolding. "What's your job anyway?" Margaret asked, smirking. "Let me guess. You're in sales, maybe customer service." Elias met her gaze briefly but didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to his journal, determined not to give her the reaction she seemed to want. The silence made Margaret lean in further, her tone dripping with condescension. "You don't have to be embarrassed. We all have to start somewhere." Nearby, a passenger whispered to his companion, "What's her problem?" The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, creating a subtle tension that hinted this wasn't going to end quietly. As the flight prepared for takeoff, Elias adjusted his seat belt, glancing out the window as the ground crew waved their final signals to the pilot. He took a deep breath, his mind replaying Margaret's words. He thought of all the times he had been judged unfairly, assumptions made about him before he could even speak. The weight of those experiences pressed against him, mingling with the knowledge that his silence might be taken as consent. His eyes flicked to a young black boy sitting a few rows ahead, watching the exchange with wide, curious eyes. Elias felt a pang in his chest. "If I don't say something now, what kind of example am I setting for him?" Margaret muttered another insult under her breath, just loud enough for Elias to hear. Elias straightened his posture, his decision made. He turned to her, slowly, his calm demeanor masking the strength behind his words. "Mom, I think it's time we had a conversation." Several passengers paused, what they were doing to watch, their curiosity palpable. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Elias spoke clearly, his voice steady, but filled with quiet authority. "You don't know me, but you've decided everything about me based on your own assumptions. Let me correct a few of them." Margaret blinked, her smirk faltering. "Excuse me." Elias reached into his backpack and pulled out his NASA identification badge, sliding it across the tray table toward her. "Dr. Elias Grant, astronaut, astrophysicist, and yes, I did go to college." Margaret's face turned pale as she picked up the badge, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. Passengers nearby gasped audibly, the sound breaking the tense silence in the cabin. One of them leaned toward his friend. Wait, did he just say astronaut? The buzz of whispers spread quickly, rippling through the cabin. The cabin grew increasingly quiet as Elias' calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the growing tension. Margaret's pale face reflected her realization of the gravity of her misjudgment. The badge in her trembling hands bore more weight than she could handle. The flight attendant, a young woman with sharp eyes and a professional tone, approached cautiously. "Dr. Grant," she began, her voice filled with respect. "It's an honor to have you on board. Is everything all right here?" Elias nodded, a faint but knowing smile on his face. "Thank you. Everything's fine now." Passengers who had been recording put their phones down. Briefly, though some kept their cameras trained on Margaret, waiting for her response. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her earlier arrogance had evaporated, leaving only shame and discomfort. Another passenger, an older man in the row behind them, leaned forward. "Dr. Grant, thank you for your service to science in our country. It's an honor to share this flight with you." Applause erupted from nearby rows, spreading through the cabin like a wave. Margaret flinched at the sound, shrinking into her seat as the reality of her behavior sank in. The flight attendant addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're fortunate to have someone as accomplished as Dr. Grant aboard today. Let's show him our appreciation." Elias raised a hand modestly. "Thank you, but there's no need for all this. I'm just here to get home like everyone else." Margaret, still clutching the badge, whispered softly, "I didn't realize." Elias met her gaze, his expression firm but not unkind. "That's the problem, isn't it? You didn't stop to think before making assumptions." The next day, Margaret scrolled through her phone and froze when she saw a headline: "NASA astronaut Dr. Elias Grant inspires crowds at science conference." The article detailed his groundbreaking achievements and dedication to mentoring young scientists. But it wasn't just the news that shocked her. A viral video of the flight incident had surfaced, with thousands condemning her behavior. Margaret sat in silence, overwhelmed by guilt. She realized the depth of her mistake, and vowed to confront her biases and ignorance, starting now. Passengers online were sharing the story, their comments praising Elias' poise and condemning Margaret's assumptions. One comment stood out: "A lesson for all of us. Never judge someone by appearances." Margaret stared at the screen, knowing her face and name would be tied to the moment. It wasn't just a personal failure, it was a public one. Did this story leave you thinking about the power of kindness and respect? Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment where assumptions were proven wrong? Let's start a conversation. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more stories that inspire, challenge, and spark change.